I'm thrilled to have this many people here. This is great. I'm Mary Longy, a member of the Middlebury AAUW, and we've been having more of these public meetings over the last year than we have in past years, and every time we seem to get a few more people to show up, so that's terrific. We're a pretty small group. To tell you a little bit about AAUW before I introduce our guest tonight, the American Association of University Women was founded in 1881. The mission is to advance gender equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy. All to say, we're concerned about women and girls feeling that they are empowered, that they will ask for and get salaries that are equivalent to what men get for the same jobs, and just in general advocate for ourselves and for younger women and girls growing up in this world, which can be very challenging. And the Middlebury chapter meets once a month, September through May. And some of our meetings are social meetings, and then we have a few presentations like this open to the public. And I wondered if anybody who is an AAUW member would just raise your hand so people in the audience can see that there are a number of us here. But you definitely outnumber us, which is thrilling to me, so I'm very glad to see that. Some of our public meetings in the last couple of years, I think I saw Ross Conrad here. Yep, there he is. So we had Ross Conrad come, and he talked about in support of birds, bees, and butterflies, which Clara Calitri actually helped to arrange. And Jack Mayer, the author of Life in a Jar, Irina Sendler Project, and Before the Court of Heaven, talked about his books. Earlier this year, we had author and illustrator Ashley Wolf talk about her life and work, which was just delightful. She's terrific. And then Dr. Emily Glick and members of her team at the Bristol Family Health talked about medication-assisted treatment for opiate dependence. And it was a very insightful talk, and it was interesting, because I don't know if other people who were there noticed this, but right after that, there was a whole lot of news about that exact kind of treatment that she talked about with us at that thing. It was just so interesting that we heard right about it. And then last month, we had Madeline Sharrow from Migrant Justice and two of the leaders from the migrant justice community come and speak with us and about what migrant justice is doing and their efforts with Ben & Jerry's that have been so successful. So I feel as though we've really been offering a wonderful broad range of these public talks, and since he's here, I'm going to thank Chris Kirby and the Ilsley Library for allowing us to use this community room to support our efforts in this. So without further ado, I'll introduce my good friend, Matthew Kimball, who is a professor of psychology at Middlebury College. His family I've known for years, and we're so glad to have him here tonight. I left this light off so you can see the screen better, and figured that probably worked better, Matt, right?
Great.
Screen better. Yeah. So take it away, Matt.
Thank
you for being here.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. As Mary indicated, my name is Matthew Kimball. I'm currently a professor at Middlebury College, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the work I've done over the last 25 years and kind of what I've learned along the way. Starting originally when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder outside Boston at the Jamaica Plain VA. I was also a clinical researcher there for a number of years. And after having left the VA, I really have continued the work in psychological trauma as well as post-traumatic stress disorder in positions including here at Middlebury College, where I continue to collaborate with colleagues around the nation and work with the great students that are at Middlebury College. I would like to thank the AAUW as well as Ilsley Public Library for this time and space to speak with you about this, about what I consider to be a very important topic. Today I'm going to talk about psychological trauma, but focus a little bit on the brain. and the ways in which these types of experiences impact our brain and how that impacts on how and why we behave and do after these types of experiences. Particularly how it is that we think differently or maybe respond differently to our world after we have these types of experiences. So my goals today, kind of an outline, is to first talk about what is trauma and PTSD, who gets PTSD and why, what happens to your brain under stress, what are the long-term effects, and can therapy change the brain? Along the way, I hope that there are some kind of lessons learned as we talk about this that I'll also emphasize as we continue to talk about some of these topics. So let's start with the first of those, this topic of what is trauma and PTSD. Trauma is currently defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, called the DSM-5, abbreviated there. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it defines a trauma as direct exposure, either to a death, like you might think of someone, for example, who's a first responder, who would come upon a scene, for example, some actual or threatened serious injury of some type that happens either to yourself or someone that you care about, sexual violence, either experienced or witnessed. But it's not limited to that. It can include indirect exposure. For example, learning that a close friend has been seriously injured or has suddenly been killed would also qualify for trauma. This is the proverbial call in the middle of the night, right, where you get a phone call and it's just absolutely shocking news. That would qualify for trauma, as would exposure to these as a function of your job. People have developed an increasing appreciation that just because it's your job to be a fireman or a law enforcement officer or an EMT, by no means does it make you immune to the effects of the trauma that you might be exposed to as a result of that. And I want to highlight the notion that we will be pretty much talking about trauma as defined by the APA and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's a word that's probably quite overused today. It's become quite vernacular, and people will often refer to, granted, very difficult experiences as a trauma. But that won't be the types of trauma that we're talking about. It's really serious threats to one's life or someone else's life. So for example, you might be in a conversation with someone and they might very appropriately refer to their divorce, for example, as a trauma. I would completely agree. It's a very difficult emotional experience. In some ways, maybe more difficult than traumas that people experience. But that's not as much what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about these sudden experiences that can be prolonged at times in which there's some direct threat either to themselves or someone that they care about. Individuals who have trauma can go on to develop a range of disorders, ongoing psychological problems like depression or panic disorder, but the one you're most familiar with probably is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's because to be diagnosed with PTSD, you need to actually have a trauma, right? It's part of the actual diagnosis. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that has a series of symptoms. The first cluster is called the re-experiencing symptoms. That includes things like nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive memories, physiological and psychological reactivity when something reminds you of that trauma. It might be behavioral avoidance, withdrawing into your room and not coming out. A classic example would be a war veteran who would no longer go to Memorial Day parades is a classic example of this type of behavioral avoidance. Negative cognitions and mood. After these types of experiences, sometimes people become very negative, for example, about the future, or they become negative about themselves or the world or others. This could be a common change that occurs as a function of PTSD. And then finally, the cluster of hyperarousal, a cluster of symptoms in which we might think of as classic anxiety symptoms, things like concentration difficulties, difficulty sleeping, easily irritated or angry, or hypervigilance. Always being on guard would be classic symptoms of this as well. And so to be diagnosed with PTSD, you need some of the symptoms from each of these clusters. But one of the interesting things I think is worth discussing is the prevalence of these two things. That is, how often are they currently happening in America right now? So that's where we'll go next. And the estimates for the prevalence of trauma, that is the experience of this, having some life-threatening experience, generally are between 60 and 90%, depending on what samples you're looking at. But 90% of adult Americans have been exposed to a trauma at least once in their lifetime. This might be something like a sexual assault, it might be a physical assault, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a serious motor vehicle accident, it could be an individual who served in the military and therefore were exposed in the context of a war. All of these would be considered possible traumas. And the evidence is beginning to show fairly clearly that most of us are exposed to this at some time during our life. However, and I'm sorry, I'm realizing that's kind of low for some of you, so I'll try to fill you in, but only a fraction of the individuals with trauma go on to actually develop PTSD. The current prevalence, for example, in the United States in the past year is about 4.7%. Right? And so I make this point, and I think it's an important one, because sometimes people see trauma or the experience of trauma as some type of death sentence. Like, oh my gosh, you've been traumatized, right? And no one would wish that on anyone. It's an incredibly difficult experience, but there's only a subset of individuals who go on to actually develop a chronic PTSD response to that. Right? And so an individual, somewhat surprisingly, after a trauma can actually expect, using their regular coping skills and their capacity of resilience, they can actually expect to get better, okay? And so that's really important to keep in mind as a community member or a parent, right? Or a child or a brother or sister. When these types of experiences happen to other people, more often than not, they do get better, yeah.
Could you explain that 4.7 in the past year and 8% lifetime is half of the lifetime? I don't think I'm understanding that.
Yeah, so the question is, just so everyone can hear it, the difference between these figures here of 8.3 and 4.7. So a lot of these individuals who have 4.7 prevalence, right, would continue to have it throughout their entire life. So this number is sort of subtracted from that number, right? And so 8.3% of individuals report at some point in their life that they've had it, 4.7 in the past year. Okay. So lesson one that I think is important to keep in mind is that while trauma is prevalent, post-traumatic stress disorder is not. And I think that begs kind of the interesting question of, well, who gets PTSD and why then, right? Because we can imagine a situation, it's not unusual for two individuals to experience exactly the same trauma, and one go on to develop PTSD and the other not, right? And to some extent, this is the million-dollar question in psychiatry in the field of trauma. Like, why do some people develop and not? Because if we have a handle on that, well, we can do better preventive strategies and certainly better treatment to minimize why that might be the case. So, so that's where we're going to go next. Who gets PTSD, why? PTSD and why? And I'm going to focus here on individual differences, and this is where we're going to make that move to the brain a little bit. Because people vary, right, and have individual differences in how they respond to stress. Some people are tall, some people are small, some people have blonde hair, some people have brown hair, and some people react really strongly to stress, and others don't. It's just kind of the way some people are built, right? So we have these fight or flight responses, and I have a colleague of mine named Andrew Morgan, who is at Yale University, who did work with SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training, first developed by the Air Force in order to help their pilots who get caught behind enemy lines survive, evade, resist, and escape if they can. And so these days, this training often occurs with many special forces. You can think of this as Navy SEALs type training, and it is really stressful training, right? They take these individuals, they put them usually in some jungle environment, they give them no food, they give them no water, they give them no heat, and they're like, try to avoid these professional soldiers who are going to be trying to track you down, okay, over the next couple of weeks. Very, very stressful training and a very interesting model for stress. Here, for example, is them in captivity, right? And so they'll actually take these individuals, capture them, put them in a situation. What, of course, they're trying to do is prepare them for the circumstances in the event their plane ever goes down behind enemy lines. So extremely stressful. My colleague at Yale University, Andrew Morgan, did research on the individuals in this SEER training to see who washes out and who doesn't. And as you know, in that type of Navy SEAL training, less than 50% ever make it through. So they're really interested. There's an interesting kind of inadvertent research design where you can look at these people going in, study them a little bit, and see who makes it through and who doesn't, right? And one of the interesting things that emerged from this research is that there were individual differences in a brain neuropeptide called neuropeptide Y. Right, in this particular case, what they found is those individuals who did really well during this training and were really successful and were able to get through were individuals who showed strong stress responses, but actually had a lot of neuropeptide Y, which buffered those stress responses. So these individuals are in very stressful situations and are calm, cool, and collected. And they're just born that way. They're not made that way, right? They have more of this neuropeptide Y that allows them to handle these stressful situations. I would argue, for example, that quarterbacks in football, if I could ever do it, probably have a lot of neuropeptide Y. They need to think clearly, right, when 350-pound linemen, right, are trying to kill them, right? And so, so my guess is that there is a preponderance of individuals who can think calmly under pressure. And my colleague, Andrew Morgan at Yale, did some of that work. Individuals differ in what we call conditionability, right? The tendency for you to learn associations between stimuli and fearful events, right? And so think of an example of a small boy walking to school one day. He walks by a white picket fence and there's a big dog behind that fence. And he doesn't know it, dog comes charging out, bark, 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 right at the fence, right? There's going to be a subset of kids who are going to be really frightened by that experience, right? And there's going to be another kid who comes by with a stick the next day and hits all the pickets as they go by, right? To taunt the dog, right? But the point is that there might be a young boy who sees that picket fence in the future, and it's not even the same one. He steers clear, right? He avoids it. He walks around it, right? Because he started to associate that stimulus with that fearful response, right? Just built that way, okay? The other thing that's really interesting is that there's some people that not only learn these associations more quickly, but they're also individuals who unlearn them more quickly. Like once they learn that association of that picket fence and fear, it's harder for them to unlearn that experience than maybe someone else, right? So there's that issue of conditionability. Finally, there's been interesting data for a long time that we have been trying to understand. And that is, for some reason that people didn't completely appreciate, women were at much higher risk for the development of PTSD after trauma than men are. They have about double the risk for PTSD relative to men. And it's not just because the exposure of certain types of trauma that women are at higher risk for are particularly virulent, like sexual assault. Even in similar traumas, women have higher rates. So people are trying to figure out, like, what is this about? Particularly when women, all things being equal, are better at seeking help. They're better at providing social support for each other. So there were a number of things that we would predict that was the case. Well, some colleagues up the road at UVM, collaborating with Emory University, found again this hormone called PACAP, right? And in that particular case, women with above average PACAP levels and PTSD symptom scores were 5 times more likely, right, to develop PTSD when exposed to trauma than individuals with lower levels. Okay, they're just born with this, right? This is not something they can control, and so our individual differences biologically interact with the trauma that's occurring that creates stress responses in some individuals that don't occur in others. So the second lesson that I want to that I've learned, through my experience is that the development of PTSD after a trauma is not some personal failure. Okay, the expression I like to use sometimes is, there by the grace of God go I, right? If I had a different biology, right, I would be responding to that stressor much like someone else, right? And so there is that factor to consider, that when it comes to development, it's really not something that we can control. And I think this is important to keep in mind, because in my experience, sometimes the toughest people on people with PTSD are the individuals who had the same trauma but didn't develop PTSD. Because their attitude often is, well, I went through it and I'm fine, i.e. what's wrong with you? That's a mentality we have to eliminate, okay? Because there, by the grace of God, go I. It could be you, it just happens not to be you because you don't have the type of biology that reacts to these particular experiences. So I would also argue that those same people who are more likely to develop PTSD after these experiences are often the empaths in our society, the people who have a capacity for compassion, right, and empathy. So the same person who may develop PTSD as a trauma is the same person who maybe is a phenomenal school teacher, right? And so in one environment, they excel with that characteristic. In another environment, they might go on to develop PTSD. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. So what's next? Well, what happens to your brain under stress? While that stressor is happening, on average, how do our brains respond? And I'm going to talk about a number of things here. There's so much we could talk about. I'm going to focus on a couple that I think will be of interest to you and I think will highlight the way our biology interacts with the experiences to create how we respond to these types of situations. One is on the one hand, while memories often become very clear, okay, that is, you might think about flashbulb memories as an example from these types of experiences, they also tend to be fragmented. And hopefully by the time I'm done here, you'll understand how both of those can be true at the same time. In addition, there's a subset of individuals who have the really unusual experience of depersonalizing, the experience of actually leaving your body, right? That experience of floating above yourself. This happens to a subset of individuals who have these types of very stressful experiences. And so let's start with this first one, right? This is memories that become really strong and consolidated after trauma. Now, this happens on average to all of us. We tend to remember really bad events than others, but as I've already referred to, and will be kind of a mantra as we go through the talk, is there a subset of individuals for whom this happens more so than others. But there's a structure in the brain called the hippocampus, which lays down memories. If you have damage to your hippocampus, you won't be able to remember anything. There's some famous clinical cases in neuropsychology, for example, where someone got damage to their hippocampus as a function of psychosurgery or epilepsy, and then therefore could lay down no new memories, right? The hippocampus is clearly critical for that. That hippocampus, here's well, not your brain. I was going to say your brain. I hope it's not your brain, right? Here's a brain here. The frontal lobe is out front. That's towards the front of your head. There's the back. There's the temporal lobe off to the side. You can think of temple as in your temples, right? There's the top. And underneath all that cortical material, that material that makes us uniquely human, our cortex, is a structure called the hippocampus. It's part of the limbic system, and this whole thing is sort of covered by this cortical material. There's the hippocampus here, part of a system called the limbic system, which is sort of underneath. These are called subcortical structures for obvious reasons. They're under the cortex, right? And so they're there, and there's that hippocampus. And when that hippocampus is exposed to adrenaline, its job is already to remember stuff. When it's exposed to adrenaline, it remembers things really well, okay? And so, for example, they've done randomized control trials where they've had kids just like learn a list of numbers, and they've randomly assigned someone to get adrenaline injections and other ones who don't. And the ones who get the adrenaline injections remember those word lists better, right? Well, under stress, you have massive adrenaline release. When you have massive adrenaline release, that's going to consolidate those memories. You're going to lay them down more clearly, and they're going to stick with you longer. And so that's how we end up with these things like flashbulb memories, right? This is, of course, flashbulb memories related to people who are like our age, right? Many of us would remember the shuttle disaster, maybe where we were when we heard that Princess Diana died, where we were perhaps when the military verdict occurred. All of these flashbulb memories occur in circumstances probably due to the fact of this momentous event. We can appreciate the fact that there's an evolutionary history there, right, where it probably makes sense for evolution to select for a trait where we remember really stressful things, i.e., so we don't do it again in the future, right, and deselect ourselves from the population, right? So, so that's one of the factors that are there. So on the one hand, they're very clear, and on another point, they're fragmented. Like individuals who have these traumas often don't have these like clear narratives about what happened. One of my first early experiences as an intern at the VA is a gentleman who remembers walking into a village in Vietnam, he remembers walking out of a village in Vietnam, he remembers nothing in between. And of course, part of you is asking the question like, how can you not remember that? How can you not remember the experience in a village in Vietnam when you were at that young age? Well, we have a greater appreciation for why that happens, and there's some biological explanations for that. There's a structure called the thalamus. The thalamus is, again, one of these subcortical structures. But if we were to extend this down here, this is your spinal cord. It's going up to your brainstem, and it makes its way to your thalamus. The thalamus is often known as the brain's relay station, right? Because all sensory information from your eyes, from your sense of touch, from your tongue, all go through the thalamus. The only one that doesn't go through is olfaction, sense of smell, and that actually has interesting implications we can perhaps talk about in the discussion area if you're interested. So this is the brain's relay station. All information comes up through the thalamus. So that's great, and that works fine if the thalamus is working fine. But under stress, it doesn't. Okay, the thalamus does not work in the way that it usually does under conditions of extreme stress. It oscillates in a different way under those particular circumstances. And so if this is responsible for the fidelity of the sensory information making it to the rest of your brain, and it's not working well, that information is not going to make it to the rest of your brain, right? So here is a surgery, post-mortem surgery done on a real brain. There's the thalamus in the middle there. And can you see all these striations here? These are all axons, right? Nerves, right? Going from that thalamus to every single part of the brain, right? It sends all the information that's coming in out to everywhere, right? And so as a result of that, if this isn't working well, it's not going to make it there. So sometimes we may forget something, but probably memories are fragmented in trauma because if the thalamus isn't working well, when it's under stress, that information never gets there in the first place, right? It's never encoded, right? So it's not necessarily a notion of repression, which might be something you're familiar with. It literally doesn't make it to the memory centers in the first place. And so that seems to be part of the picture. In addition, we've got this big frontal lobe on the front of our head. It's part of what makes us uniquely human, and it helps us focus our attention on things that we need to focus our attention on. It's part of its job. And one of the things that happens under stress is we show a narrowing of attentional focus, right? Almost like a tube, right? Where our attention gets locked in on something particular, which is great, except for the fact that it screens out everything else. Right? And so under extreme stress, our narrowed attention gets locked in and other sensory information gets not processed. And so this is why often after a trauma, someone will be able to tell you something in great detail about a particular detail, but not remember the big picture. Individuals have known this for a long time before they understood maybe the role of attention in this. They call it weapons bias, right? And so it's not unusual. Law enforcement officers for decades were driven crazy by asking people, tell me what the perpetrator looked like who stuck you up with the gun. And people would always say the same thing. I can't tell you what they look like, but I can tell you what the gun looks like, okay? Because they were locked in on the gun, right? What was the hair color? I'm not sure. What was the color of the jacket? I'm not sure. Or were they white or black? I think they were white, right? Because they were so locked in on something specific. And we all do this under certain circumstances, but in times of stress, it really locks in. Let me show you one other video clip here. And it'll seem silly, and it is a bit enjoyable, but you'll understand why I'm showing it to you in a minute.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir. Well, I was planting my petunias in the packing shed. Constable, arrest Lady Smythe. But how did you know, madam? As any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away. It's just a matter of observation.
So did anybody notice anything strange about that video? What's that? And is that different? Okay, all right. So that's one thing you noticed.
How observant were you?
There were 21 changes in that video. Watch it carefully. This is a single cut now.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me
Even the dead guy changes.
precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones downstairs, sir.
And I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Okay, so why am I showing you this, right? Well, it's a phenomenon called change blindness, right? And it's a phenomenon where even when really dramatic things change, we tend not to notice, right? And this happens under fairly normal circumstances. When you're under stress, it happens even more so, right? The incapacity, if you're narrowed or focused on some aspect of that particular video, you're not going to notice anything else. And so I remember, because I was looking at the weapons, I was looking at the candlestick, right, and I was looking at the roller that they had, and that was the one thing, and I did think I noticed the first time I watched it, something that was sort of odd, but I didn't notice the other 20 changes, right, as a result of that. That's because we were focused on one thing. And so this is why individuals can go through traumas, right, locked in on one thing, have this entire experience and only be able to tell you fragments, right? It's often fragmented as a result of that. And the reason why I think this is important is it's so often that people tend to disbelieve the stories of people who've had these traumas because, well, how can you possibly say that? You can't even remember X, Y, and Z. It's very important to know that just because you don't remember some parts of the story doesn't mean the other parts of the story that you remember are accurate. And this becomes really important in court cases, right, and situations where you have eyewitness testimony to events, to recognize that people can have fairly accurate memory of certain parts of the event while having significant gaps in the other. And the fact that they have gaps in one area doesn't necessarily undermine the validity of their testimony in other situations. The last one I want to talk about is depersonalization. And the reason I want to talk about this is this is an experience where an individual experiences floating outside their body during a trauma. So I'm going to ask anybody, has anybody had this experience and willing to share? Anybody had the experience of being under stress or having a fever or something like that and having this experience of floating outside the body? Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, we were in Papua New Guinea, and a guy came down with a gun, threatened us, fired once, we hit the ground, and I can just sort of remember sort of going through what I would do and stuff, sort of being in a different area. And then he came down and said, I want a death. We saw him loading the gun again, and I charged him and tackled him.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so that's a really good example. Extremely stressful situation where someone sort of like witnesses the situation from the outside. Now again, this is one of those traits that people vary on. Some people depersonalize fairly easy in these circumstances. Some people will never depersonalize. The individuals who survive severe SEER training or Navy SEALs training are not individuals who depersonalize, okay? But other people do. And the reason I bring this up in particular is because it's such an unusual experience for which we had no idea what was going on for a century. Like, we could not imagine what was going on in these individuals when they would have this depersonalization experience. We know that it would happen in other circumstances. We know, for example, sometimes fever would bring it on, sometimes exhaustion would bring it on, sometimes anesthesia would bring it on. These would all be circumstances in which you would have it. But it also happened under situations of extreme stress. And so individuals were very interested in the work of Dr. Olaf Blank, who started to develop an appreciation for how and when these phenomena tend to happen. And I like this part of the story because it was something that we were so lost about that good experimental design helped us understand the role that the brain plays in these situations. So depersonalization is this phenomenon of separation of self from body, and it's related to a structure called the Temporoparietal Junction, right? So here's our brain again, there's the front out there, and this junction, right about where the parietal lobe connects with the temporal lobe, seems to be highly associated with depersonalization. We now know, for example, that if you stimulate that brain with an electrode in someone, they will experience this sense of going outside their body. But Olaf Blank did this very interesting research in which he was able to kind of demonstrate how and why this phenomenon might happen, as unusual and as strange it might seem. So here's a research participant in his study. There's a virtual reality camera there. He's got a virtual reality set of binoculars on, and what he does is the way he sets it up is this person, in a kind of, I feel like, creepy way, right? He's able to project an image of this person in front of themselves. So they're able to see themselves from the back. Okay, and so when they're in their virtual reality situation and they move their arms, their virtual body moves their arms. Okay, and so they're able to basically see themselves. Then what he does is he takes a rod and strokes the person's spine rhythmically at the same rate that he strokes the spine of the virtual person. Okay, so this person is experiencing this stroking on the back while there's a virtual stick stroking their virtual body. And when this happens, the person starts to experience them leaving their body. They start, their sense of self, right, leaves their own body, and they report it as somewhere between the two places. Okay, so experimentally, they're actually able to develop a scenario in which individuals develop this out-of-body experience, which for so long we were such a loss at. And so this would be, this is a screenshot from a video that he has on TED Talk. So if you're interested in this, you can follow up with that. Out-of-body experiences by Dr. Olaf Blanc. And again, it's this part of the brain right here, this temporoparietal junction. This time the frontal lobe's there, so it's back there at that temporoparietal junction. And so what they do is they'll have someone with a virtual reality machine on. They will see this individual get their back stroked. At the same time, okay, so this is what they see, their own body getting sort of stroked with this thing. At the same time that there's a little knob in this MRI, right, where they're lying down, that is stroking their body at the same tempo that the virtual person's getting stroked, the person that they see themselves. While all that's going on, they're in the MRI, so they're monitoring their brain. And when they have that experience and they say, that's it, my body, like I just left my body, this part of the brain is really active. Right? So we know that this is the case. Now, for some reasons that we don't understand, there are some people for whom that system becomes active during stress, right? And when that becomes active during stress, that's when they experience that out-of-body experience, right? So really kind of almost mystical type of experience that we're starting to get a better grip on. So these are some of the things that happen to our brain under stress, like this narrowing of attention, this depersonalization, this weapons focus. All of these are aspects of our brain under stress. So what are the long-term effects? So this is what happens under acute stress. What are the possible long-term consequences? So these are all the symptoms of PTSD here. We're obviously not going to go through them. I'm going to pick a few of them that I think are interesting and also indicate the way that trauma affects our brain and the impact it has on us. One are these recurrent involuntary distressing memories. Okay, these are what they call intrusive memories of the trauma. Another is this intense or prolonged psychological distress or trauma when reminded of that experience, or marked physiological reactions when something reminds of the trauma. That is increased heart rate or blood pressure or sweating that occurs when something reminds us of the trauma. So these are experiences that can be triggered, is a term people use. Also, there's persistent, exaggerated negative beliefs about others and the self. We'll talk about that, as well as the phenomenon of hypervigilance. Okay, so these are some of the ones we're going to pick out that are impact of trauma on our brain that creates these types of symptoms. Okay. So the first two, hopefully you already have some appreciation for, right? This notion that we can have these intrusive memories, they consolidated very strongly. We have this tendency to pair stimuli with other types of experiences, and so these intrusive memories might be triggered. Okay, that is, I worked with a veteran from Vietnam, for example, who kept coming to the clinical practice and reporting that he only had intrusive memories while he was at work. So I asked him what he does for work. He says, well, I work on boats. I do fine woodwork on boats. So I inquired more, fine woodwork on boats. Like, I don't own a yacht, so I don't know any of the details of this kind of stuff. But he described to me that they often use tropical woods. Woods like teak is very common on these boats. So it turns out that every time he was sawing or sanding or burning this wood, it was reminding him of napalm in Vietnam. right? And so he wouldn't have, in the burning of the forest, right, in Vietnam. And so he wouldn't have these other experiences, but that experience triggered in his brain and made this automatic association between this particular smell and those particular memories, because those memories were laid down when that smell was present. And because he was the type of person who had these strong capacity for these strong connections, he would have those experiences in those situations. When a trauma is over, another possible outcome are negative expectations. Okay, and so I'm going to show you a sentence on this computer screen that's going to have that's going to come up one word at a time, and the final word of the sentence is blank. Okay, I want you to think about the first word that comes to mind. Okay, and some of you dare tell me, I am a psychologist, right? I'll try not to make too much of this stuff, right? But anyway, are you ready? I'm going to show you a sentence one word at a time. Fill in the blank when we get there. Here we go. Did a word come to mind? Anyone willing to volunteer? What word did you come up with?
Dog.
What's that?
Dog.
Dog. Unfortunately, I lost his dog. Leg. Head. What's that?
Hair.
Okay. All right. Good. So we got a bunch of ones that are coming up. Lost his hair. Like was one of the hair. I think that one. Okay. When we give this sentence, most people come up with many of the ones you come up with. Keys is kind of prevalent. Unfortunately, I lost his keys or lost his wallet. You'll hear that one a lot. What happens less often, although it did happen once in this crowd, is less often you'll get an ending like the unfortunate man lost his leg. Okay, that's less typical of a response. And you never get an ending like the unfortunate man lost his cloud. Okay, now why am I telling you this? Well, I'm telling you this because myself and my colleague, Kevin Fleming, in the back corner there, did some research with some combat veterans in which we had this notion, right, that if individuals with PTSD expect negative things to happen, and we show them sentences that say, the unfortunate man lost his leg, they're not going to show much surprise to that sentence in ways that other people might. Right? Because of their experience, they're expecting negative outcomes to ambiguous situations, right? So that's exactly what we did. We brought many veterans in, we showed them these series of sentences. Classically, what happens is you get a large brain response, shown here. See how much more negative that blue is than those other two lines, right? That large negativity, that large brain response occurs to words like the unfortunate man lost his cloud. Like, it doesn't make any sense, you get a big brain response. It's an index of surprise and unexpectedness, right? When you have words in normal samples, like the word keys, you don't get that big brain response. So this brain response right here, we call it the N400. This name is not important, but the point is you get this big brain response when you get these surprising endings. So then we, asked ourselves the question, well, if that's true, and individuals who have PTSD are expecting negative events, we'll show them these series of sentences, and individuals with PTSD aren't going to be surprised by sentences that end like the unfortunate man lost his leg, and people without PTSD are going to be quite surprised by that ending, at least on average, right? And that's exactly what we found. Okay, so here's some data from 39 research participants. This is the size of the brain response in this case. This is how negative they see the world. And you can see this fairly strong relationship that the more, when they were looking at negative endings to sentences, the more negative worldviews they had, the smaller the brain response was to negative endings. People follow me? Right? The more that they had negative expectations of the world, they weren't surprised by sentences that ended negatively. In fact, they showed the inverse, and they were surprised by sentences that happened normally. So when you showed them the unfortunate man lost his keys, they're like, that's weird. Right? I was expecting him to lose his leg. Right? And so it just speaks to the way these types of experiences change the way people look at the world. The other thing I'll point out is if we have a timeline down here, this is a timeline of a second. So this response is happening in a split second, 400 milliseconds, right? That means this is happening very early and automatically in these particular cases. Kevin Fleming and I also did work looking at hypervigilance. This is a slide from one of our studies in which you can see these were carefully matched by one of my students for figural complexity, for some of the events that are going on. This is a scene in a local American park. This is a scene from Iraq or Afghanistan. Both kids are playing soccer in both cases, and we just told our participants, just look at these pictures as they interest you. Right? Didn't give them any other directions in that. Just look at this slide. And both of these pictures were up at the same time, so they had a choice about which of these to look to. Here's another example here put together, right? Carefully kind of crafted, so they're matched on a number of different important characteristics. And we saw it as well. So what I'm going to show you next is some data of eye tracking, where we have an eye tracker in our lab where we can track where people are looking at these particular pictures. So when I click the button, you'll see a little movie sort of run, and you'll see a green dot, and that's actually where this person is looking as they look at this particular stimuli. Okay, so that'll run through again. So starting again. So that's where they're focusing on. I like they're looking at the gas prices over there. Must have been when they started to go up. But you get an idea of this type of data. And one of the things that we noticed that we were able to publish in the Journal of Anxiety Disorders is that individuals with PTSD look first, look longest, and have bigger pupils to negative stimuli. We used a different set of stimuli for this as well, which were stimuli that were motor vehicle accidents. And what was really interesting is even the individuals who were vets from Afghanistan also spent more time looking at motor vehicle accidents. They had this generalized tendency to look towards threat, right? And had a difficulty disengaging from that threat. The pattern that you saw here was really classic. They would look first at the threatening stimulus, glance over here briefly to see what that other thing was, realize that it's not of much importance, and spend the rest of their time looking at that quote-unquote threatening stimuli. So you know, we feel like this data is really important because it indicates that these responses are automatic, right? That they're very early, and these types of experiences change the way these individuals look at the world. So lesson 3, I would argue, is many of responses in individuals with PTSD are automatic and beyond their volitional control. Another thing you will often hear from individuals who don't have PTSD and are struggling to live with someone with PTSD is, oh, why don't you just get over it? Right? Oh, I mean, come on. Like, how long is this going to go on for? Well, they don't get over it because a lot of this stuff is fairly automatic, right? And happening very early in the processing stream. And is impacted by their experiences and eventually possibly their development of PTSD. So this is not something that you can just get over, right, once it becomes some type of chronic response after that trauma. So that answers, kind of begs a really interesting question. Well, that sounds really bad, right? You know, that it's automatic, that it's early, that there's not much you can do about whether you get it or not. And so I think a really important question that we'll finish on today is whether therapy can change the brain, right? Our argument has been these types of experiences have changed the brain in such a way that results in many of the symptoms we see. Can therapy change it back? And I'm focusing on psychotherapy versus medication because I think you already have an implicit sort of sense that medication would change the way the brain would work, right? And it is true that medication can be an effective therapy for PTSD. Medications like Prozac or Zoloft, medications in the class we call SSRIs, or anti-anxiety agents. The best way to characterize it is it helps some of the people some of the time. Okay, they can be effective treatments, and I think we all can appreciate why, because they change the underlying biology. But I think what's far more interesting is the data indicating that psychotherapy definitely works for people with PTSD. So if trauma affects the brain, then it begs the question, well, what could therapy really possibly do for you? So that's what we'll look at. Well, we've known for a while, don't worry, I'm not going to emphasize part of this, right, that this is a careful analysis of many studies in PTSD. I'm going to highlight this part, it's the only part you need to read, right? Results suggest that psychotherapy for PTSD leads to large initial improvements from baseline. More than half of patients who complete treatment with various forms of cognitive behavioral therapy or eye movement desensitization reprocessing improve. Okay, so we already know that this works fairly effectively. Similar to medication, it works for much of the people, much of the time, okay? And again, we're really interested in why and how it works for some people, but not others. Psychologists and psychiatrists are trying to figure that out now. But this is the work of a colleague of mine at the University of Tasmania, actually in Australia, Kim Felmingham. And she did a study in which she provided therapy for individuals, measured their brain before therapy, measured their brain after therapy, because they were interested in looking at how the brain changed as a function of psychotherapy. Well, not only did the brain change as a function of psychotherapy, but it changed as a function of how much better the person got, right? So this is part of the brain called the anterior cingulate, right here. It's in our frontal lobe. So this is the front of a person's brain, the top and the back. Here is the structure called the anterior cingulate gyrus, and it's part of what I would say, among many other things, controls our emotional system or our limbic system, kind of dampens it down if necessary or accentuates it. And so what's really interesting is that in individuals who got much better in treatment, their anterior cingulate at the end of treatment was much more active than it was before treatment started. And one of the things that the anterior cingulate does is dampen down a structure called the amygdala in the brain, which is associated with fear. And so you have this extra active anterior cingulate, which, by the way, is dampening the response of the amygdala. So again, people who got better showed significant decreases in their fear center of their brain after treatment than before. That is, the people who improved a lot showed a large change in the amygdala, okay, indicating that psychotherapy was changing the brain, right, and changing the way we responded to this type of stuff. So how does this work? How does this occur? Well, I would remind you that our brains are not some digital file, right? That our brains are not some CD or compact disc or DVD that we load things on and it stays perfect. It's a neural substrate, right? It's biological and therefore changes as a function of experience. And so it can change after trauma, but very possibly it can change it back. There was a question there?
Just about the amygdala.
Yep.
How were they measuring it? What was the medium they were measuring?
Great question. They were using an MRI.
What, MRI?
Yeah.
And that, so it's physical structure it was measuring, not chemical or any other?
Correct. So the amygdala's actual structure, great question, what they were measuring was the activation of the amygdala. And so in individuals in which it's very active, they're very afraid. So we know, for example, if you take an electrode and put it in the amygdala of a cat and stimulate the cat, you're going to get the arched back, the hissing, the hair on the back of the neck standing up. That's what the amygdala does. It actually generates our fight or flight response. So the really good news here is cognitive behavior therapy, right, in this particular case, in individuals who got better, showed significant dampening from pre to post-treatment in that area of the brain associated with fear.
Did they use a substrate or other substance to measure that, or is it just strictly through the MRI itself?
It's through the MRI. Yeah, that's pretty much what they use. Good question. So, now, I set this up by saying, our brain is obviously biological in nature. It changes as a function of experience. And so we need to revisit this issue that I introduced earlier, right, which is conditionability. And I argue that there's some people who are more conditionable and therefore they're vulnerable, perhaps developing PTSD. But if we bring people back and have them talk about their trauma, they can learn to be unafraid of those memories. Okay? Almost any treatment for PTSD has a component to it that they call memory work. And you can call it behavioral therapy, you can call it cognitive behavior therapy, you can call it eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, you can call it psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy. Almost any treatment that works for PTSD does memory work. Okay, and memory work is thinking back about the memory in detail. Okay, and so how that works is by re-accessing that memory. What has always happened for that individual for years after the trauma, if they have PTSD, is every time that memory happens, they get really quite frightened. It's another conditioning trial. It's another opportunity for that memory to be paired with fear. So they've actually just strengthened that response, right? And so often people distract themselves and run off and go do something else, but they've had another trial where the memory is associated with fear. You bring them into psychotherapy, develop a rapport, have them get comfortable, and have them access the memory. And the first time they access memory in therapy, they're terrified. But they're less terrified the second time, and even more so the third time. And as time goes on, by 6, 7, or 8 sessions, they're having the memory and they're not having the fearful response. And so suddenly, you're pairing that memory with a neutral emotional response, right? And so the individual actually learns to pair that memory with some emotion that isn't fear anymore, right? And so that's how we can teach individuals to learn to be unafraid. The second part is involved with engaging the frontal lobe, right? This part of the brain that makes us uniquely human. Psychotherapy, right, and through what talk therapy helps people look at the world differently, and that changing of that frontal lobe and that increasing of the activation of things like the anterior cingulate that I showed you earlier inhibits some of those fear centers in the brain and makes individuals less likely to be fearful down the road. Okay, so this is how this thing called psychotherapy works, right? Really interesting study by Brody and colleagues in 2001. They actually did this in depression, but it's been done across many types of anxiety disorders and depressive disorders. In this study, they randomly assigned individuals with depression to either therapy or medication. You either got basically Prozac or you got some type of psychotherapy. So they either had interpersonal therapy or Prozac. Then before treatment, they had these certain brain abnormalities because they were struggling with depression, high prefrontal cortex activity, and thalamic activity, and lower activity in the temporal lobes. What the particular structures aren't so important. What is really interesting is treatment normalized those brain changes. They became normal. But what was really interesting is it didn't matter what treatment they received. Whether they received medication or psychotherapy, either way, it normalized, right? And so that was really interesting research, and this effect has been shown in a number of different types of disorders. Again, indicating that psychotherapy is changing the brain. In some ways, it might be fairly similar to the way medication does it. Okay, so I'm going to finish with an anecdote, a story that comes from some of my experience of working with individuals with trauma. Does anyone recognize any of these pictures? Does it ring a bell at all? Okay, so that's the Korean War Memorial. There was a famous battle in Korea, of which this is from.
Incheon.
Yeah, Incheon is where they landed, right? And they ended up at the Chosin Reservoir. Chosin Reservoir, right? And the reason I bring this story up is I think it's an anecdote that so wonderfully illustrates the way that psychotherapy can help change your traumas. I was an intern at the VA at the time, and a Korean War veteran came. He was part of this battle at the Chosin Reservoir, an absolutely famous battle within the annals of the Marines, in the sense that they were completely surrounded, and they had to fight their way back to Incheon, actually, which is where the landing occurred, right? They were completely surrounded, both by the Korean army as well as the Chinese army, who surprised them. That was why they ended up being surrounded. So I met with this individual the very first time doing an evaluation. I met with him the very first day. We sat down and I said, tell me about your experiences in Korea. And he told this interesting story. He says, well, I'll never forget. The many memories I'll never forget. But one of them is, I went to Korea. I'm a young kid. It was my first combat situation. We get situated at the bottom of one of these mountains, okay, bivouac for the night, and then find out that the entire Chinese army is on the other side of that pass, right? And that we're going to die tomorrow. It's over, right? Is what he realized. So he wrote the proverbial letter to his mother, gave it to a friend. I'm probably not going to make it. Probably none of us are going to make it. But if you can survive this, send it back to my mom. So that was a very compelling story and fairly consistent with aspects of the truth, right? That in fact, the Marines who were in the Chosin Reservoir were in fact surrounded and surprised by the Chinese army, who were not far away when they bivouacked that night. So it was really interesting. I saw him 6 to 8 sessions, right? And if I remember, I said they were just over that mountain pass, about half a day's hike. I saw him for 6 to 8 sessions, and he retold that story. And the next time he told the story, he said, yeah, that night I camped when the Chinese army was 2 days march away. And I'm thinking to myself, last time he told this story, it was half a day away. Like, what is true? So I'm on Google next, like, how far was the Chinese army, et cetera, right? Then it turns out this individual got assigned to me for psychotherapy. I saw him for 3 or 4 months. We did memory work around a whole host of memories, not this one. And at the end of psychotherapy, the Chinese army was 5 days away, right? And so, as a function of that psychotherapy, it changed his memory of that experience. And I think what happened is that when he was telling that story, and he was feeling increasingly safe with me, he would access that memory and feel safe, right? And then he would come back to it and he felt even safer. And the third time he told it, he felt even safer. So suddenly he was accessing that memory and the emotion of safety was associated with it. And that emotion of safety actually changed his memory of that experience of being increasingly safe in that first situation. To this day, I have no idea which of those is true. I don't know whether it was a half-day march or a 5-day march. But you know what? I don't care, right? Because the patient was getting better, right? At a certain level, right? That's what was important from that subjective level of experience. And so what was going on there, I think, was this changing of his memories as a function of his brain changing as a function of going through psychotherapy in ways that were therapeutic for him in those particular cases. So this final lesson is that while trauma and PTSD can change the brain, so can therapy. Right? There is certainly reasons to be helpful or hopeful in that regard. So I'm going to stop there, leave time, hopefully plenty of time for questions. I do want to acknowledge some funding from the National Institute of Mental Health for the research that I'm doing at Middlebury College, the Middlebury Matching Fund as well, who helps support some of the students as well as some of the equipment we have. Kevin Fleming, my colleague from Norwich University, who I did a lot of the work with that I'm showing here today, and many of my students who I had to spend all the time putting those pictures together, right, and all that stimuli and analyzing all this data. So thank you very much. That concludes, and I'm happy to take questions. Some questions you have? Yes, please.
Your psychotherapy. Did you do reframing in that, or was that his own brain changes? And the question that would come up is, when he made his brain changes, did he change his memory to make him more comfortable, even though they were just as close as they were in the first place?
Can you repeat that? Well, my memory isn't what it used to be.
Okay. Well, there were a couple of things that came up when you were
Yeah.
doing psychotherapy, and
Yeah.
I was wondering whether by telling the story, they were reprocessing it for themselves, or whether you were reframing the story for them so they could use that themselves.
Yeah, and that definitely happens in the context of what we call memory work. What was so interesting about this is I never asked him about that story. Like, I never did memory work with him on that story, right? I was actually, there were a number of other types of traumas that were actually more severe than that, right? But what was interesting is this served as a proxy for him getting better. And so as he got better, that story changed.
And the question that comes for me is that it doesn't have to be true. His memory has to take the story and reframe it for himself so it's no longer threatening.
Correct.
Is that your assessment of that process?
Yeah, it's absolutely true that, you know, as a function of something like psychotherapy, I think he's certainly motivated to do that, right? He was motivated, right, for him to have this memory, but for the longest time, everything he ever tried to do to change that didn't work, right? What it really required in this case was psychotherapy, right? A sense of feeling safe under those circumstances. So he felt safe at the same time the memory was accessed, and those two things got paired instead of fear. The changing of memory is nothing surprising in the sense that there's a lot of data, even outside the realm of psychological trauma, that indicates memory is a reconstruction of events, right? It is not some perfect record, right, by any stretch of the imagination. And actually, the argument is that every time we retrieve a memory, it changes as a function of that retrieval. Even, and this is the most interesting part, is some of those flashbulb memories that I showed you earlier, even though we have very clear memories of those experiences and would swear by them, they're actually no more accurate than the rest of our memories. The only thing different between the flashbulb memories and the real memories is our belief that the flashbulb memories are more accurate. They're actually not, right? And so people are trying to understand that phenomenon better, but even in circumstances, what often happens when we're reaccessing memories, and this is what happens in psychotherapy, but it's also what happens at the dinner table, right, is you're having a conversation with someone and saying, oh, remember the time when we were camping and the bear came out of the woods, or whatever it was, right? And then someone adds an element to that story. It says, oh yeah, and do you remember X, Y, or Z happened, right? And maybe you didn't even see that. Maybe you were looking the other way. But actually, because that memory was open and available and retrieved at the time that that new piece of information comes in, it actually gets incorporated. Okay? It gets incorporated in that memory. And so we start adding pieces to our memories, and we believe them to be absolutely true, when actually there's some very clear evidence that that's not the case. In the right experimental conditions, 25% of the American population can be convinced that they were lost in the mall as a child when they were never lost in the mall. Right? And it's a really clever design by a woman named Elizabeth Loftus, in which how she set this up was she would take individuals who were like college students, and they say, okay, I'd like permission to talk to your mom. And they say, sure, or your dad, or your parent, or your guardian, right? I'd like to talk to them, and the student says, sure. So they call up the parent, and they say, give me three memories from Matthew's childhood, right? And so they give up 3 memories from Matthew's childhood, and then they ask him, have they ever been lost in the mall before? Okay. And if it turns out that the person has never been lost in the mall, they become an eligible subject for the study. Because when they come back in the study, Elizabeth Loftus says, I talked to your mom, and they told me about the time you rolled all the acorns into the street and got in trouble because the car lost control, right? That's never happened to me. Okay, or the time when you were a child when you got hit in the eye with a wiffle ball and it created a big, welt on your eye. That never happened to me either, right? And then remember the time you got lost in the mall? Actually, they didn't get lost in the mall, right? Oh, and I was talking to your mom, she told me the time you got lost in the mall. The time when you got lost in the mall because you were hiding in the coat rack, right? And your mom left, and she thought you were out there, and she couldn't find you, and so she panicked, and so she went to the intercom, and the people at the information desk, and they made a big announcement over the intercom, please come to the information desk. Matt, your mom is here waiting for you, right? And, a nice policeman came and helped you, and took your hand and walked you over there, et cetera, et cetera. So usually when people first hear that, they're like, I don't really remember that. I don't remember getting lost in the mall, right? But you bring them back a week later, and not only do 25% of them report getting lost in the mall, they start adding details. They start saying, yes, I remember the policeman, and he had this big gun, and I remember being so impressed by the gun because I never really seen one before. And I remember he had this big beard, and so they start adding things, right? And so the notion of this introduction of a memory when it's open and available can actually create memories right there. So now we can really imagine, and I think in some ways it's hopeful, how psychotherapy might work, right? As you reprocess this memory, and it changes as a function of those conversations, unpairing that fear that was originally there in ways that you no longer necessarily have those intrusive memories in ways that you would have had in the past. Yeah?
Could possibly call that brainwashing.
Called which?
So the question was, could you possibly call that brainwashing? I think it depends on who you ask, right? About whether you would consider that brainwashing or not. I think brainwashing and therapy probably differ significantly in its intent. Right? And so individuals who are psychotherapists are there whose the idea is that they have the best interest of their client in mind. Someone who's brainwashing someone has their own interest in mind. I would consider that to be one difference. But are there underlying processes to both that are similar? Absolutely. Yes, boss.
If I understand you correctly, it sounds like we can test individuals to find out how prone they are to experiencing PTSD if they get traumatized. So given that, would it make sense to screen folks that are going to be like emergency responders or going into combat and only allow those who can handle it better to do that kind of activity?
So you can imagine, for example, as an example, the military is extremely interested in this question, right? Because someone who goes on to develop PTSD becomes really very costly, right, to society, to the Veterans Administration, to the military. So they are very motivated to do this. And I think one might argue that someone who responds poorly under stress is a risk, right, for other people in their unit, for example, if they don't respond very well. So they are interested in this kind of stuff. And to be honest, it is the reason basic training has always been really hard. Right? And the reason why there has always been washouts, right? Because we could maybe come up with some biological test about whether someone can handle stress or not, right? Or we can put them through basic training and figure out whether they can handle stress or not, right? Someone might argue that that is a better indicator, right? It prepares them and trains them to do what they need to do on the one hand, and also gives sergeants the opportunity to evaluate these individuals and wash them out. right, if that is necessary. So it's not clear to me, so certainly there's no test out there, right, that's somehow better than what the military has over the years developed in order to identify individuals who are like, yeah, I think this individual will make a good, reliable soldier, versus someone who said, I think they're a risk, and therefore they need to watch out, or sometimes get assigned to non-combat roles. Individuals can play incredibly important roles in the military without being the tip of the spear, as I say. I'm going to make sure I cover lots of different questions. Yeah, please.
Do you suppose it's going to come down to a genetic predisposition, one way or another?
Yeah, my experience when it comes to psychiatric conditions is it never comes down to a genetic condition, right? In the sense that all these disorders are multifactorial, right? There are multiple factors and there's never a single gene, right? There might be a gene that predisposes you, right? That you might be an individual who has a particular type of gene. So for example, that variability in that gene in women that made them more likely to develop PTSD, they have higher risk than women who don't have that variant of the gene. So we can assess risk factors, right? But as a society, we need to be very careful, right? Because if we start discriminating against individuals because they might get PTSD, when even if the risk is 5 times as high, it still means 3 out of 4 aren't going to get it, right? And so you can't discriminate, right, against those individuals because they have some type of risk factor, right? And so we do need to be very careful about that. But we're still interested in that, and I can imagine a situation where you have circumstances like the military, where the risks are very high, where I think there could be a reasonable argument to be made if there's a constellation of risk factors in this individual and they don't do well in basic training, this is an individual who needs to be assigned another role, or maybe needs, the military is not for them. They can support the effort in some other way. Yeah. And then Alice.
The delay sometimes where like a fireman will go in, act perfectly normal, do everything he's supposed to do in a real trauma situation, and then not have it hit him for an hour or 2 hours
Yeah.
or days.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for those who may not have heard the question, how do we understand the particular circumstance where someone responds really well in a stress, right? And then after the fact, right, kind of falls apart, let's say. That's not exactly a fair term, but struggles more emotionally at some later point. That often happens most in individuals who are trained to do a job, right? People who are EMTs, for example, or emergency medical personnel often argue that in situations of extreme stress, they kind of go on automatic pilot, right? And they rely on their training to do the job, and they're not really recognizing at that particular time, maybe part for the stress focus, that I'm focused on this right now, without an awareness of how dangerous that situation really is. And I think we've all had the experience, right, of being through a very dangerous situation where we didn't appreciate half the dangerousness until we were out of it. And we're like, oh my gosh, that was really close, right? That was closer than I like, and we start to fear in that case. I've got a, well, I'll pass on that story. Alice, go ahead.
I was wondering how effective self-selection would be. We talked about boot camp, and I was just thinking, well, I probably would just elect not to go through boot camp. And I was wondering if, well, who knows? Would I be maybe just people like me be surprised that actually they're great at handling stress? Or is my aversion to it in the first place probably a good indication that I have PTSD?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So again, the question is how does self-selection help us understand and explain some of these types of phenomenon? So my instinct would be to say that if you're self-aware enough to know, right, that you're an individual who becomes easily frightened or have had frightening situations before where you've panicked, right, you're more disposed to do that in future situations. Now, through training, you might get better at that, but you're probably never going to be better than the individual who's calm and cool from the beginning, right? The problem with 18-year-olds in the military is they don't have that self-knowledge, right? They're just excited, they're interested, they want to help, they want to be a soldier, their father was in the military, whatever it is, right? And so they have to have the life experience to be able to discern that about themselves. So they go into basic training and sometimes surprise themselves. Wow, I handle this much better than I thought. Or surprise themselves. That went much more poorly than I thought, or sometimes their views are consistent. But my recommendation, right, would be for someone who really knows that about themselves, that self-selection can be an important tool. And I'm guessing that there's a whole host of people in the military who aren't there, who would be vulnerable to PTSD because they're like, you know, that those risks are not for me. I'm not that type of person. Yes?
So you're focusing here, and sounds like the DSM focuses on extreme trauma,
Yes.
physical trauma.
Yes.
What about things like the death of a parent, or childhood neglect, or trauma of that kind of nature? How does that fit in?
Yeah. So I'll take the first of those two, which is what we would call like a grief reaction, right? And again, these can be incredibly strong emotional responses that can be equally difficult to handle emotionally as some of the traumas that we talked about here. But there are some interesting parallels. And one is that in the same way that we argue that most people have some symptoms for a little while after trauma and then get better, the pattern's fairly similar for grief. Like, everybody has some symptoms after they lost somebody, and most people get better, right? There's actually an interesting parallel between those two phenomena, because there is a diagnosis out there called complicated grief, right? And that's a circumstance where it's 2 years later, it's 2.5 years later, it's 3 years later, and the person's functioning still seems to be impacted by the loss of that individual. That is very similar in some ways with what we see in PTSD, where after trauma, and this is actually an important part of the story, and I'm glad you asked the question, all of us have nightmares, right? Flashbacks, not necessarily flashbacks, but memories, physiological reactivity when something reminds us, poor sleep, can't concentrate, very typical, right? And so it's important to acknowledge that that happens to all of us. It would be odd if you didn't have that response. But the question is, what do you look like at 6 months, right? And if you haven't improved, as most people do, in 6 months, then it's the time to maybe intervene, right? So this is sort of, what would I call it, the community service part of the talk here, right? Where, I think hopefully we've learned some rules of thumb about how to handle this, because if trauma is as prevalent as it is, it's going to impact all our lives, and it has impacted all our lives, right? Whether we're a spouse, a partner, a parent, a child of someone who's experienced trauma, a good friend. And it's pretty clear that the ways for us as a community to respond to that, the number one factor for some PTSD isn't how severe the trauma is, it's the quality of social support after the trauma, which I think is really encouraging to us as a community, right?
So you would call, like, another one is parents divorcing and the impact on a child.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a huge trauma. Mm-hmm. But it's not in the DSM, so I don't.
Yeah. Well, there is a diagnosis for that that can be problematic. It's called adjustment disorder, right? Which is, again, we would fully expect that young person to be very troubled for a while, right? But if it continues to linger and be very problematic, and it's affecting their schooling, and it's affecting their friendships, and they're withdrawing, we wouldn't call that PTSD. We would call it adjustment disorder, which is fine. It reflects the fact that it wasn't some type of like life-threatening event, but it's a significant emotional event. And so that is a diagnosis that covers that type of scenario.
How about suicide of a child? Again, that's that's a horrible thing, and we're sort of living through it, and it just across the country. But when a child kills themselves with no clue at 23 years old, or that's a horrendous.
Yeah, I would, in that particular case, I would put that in the realm of PTSD, right?
To me,
that it would be a trauma, because if you remember, what we referred to is indirect exposure to the knowledge of someone that you care a lot about dying precipitously, right? And sometimes this is a motor vehicle accident, but sometimes it's a suicide. And so that would lean more towards probably a diagnosis of PTSD. Now, obviously, to a certain extent, we're splitting hairs here, right? These are incredibly difficult emotional experiences that these individuals are having, and each of them requires thoughtful care, right, in the event that the concerns and functioning continues to be impacted for quite a while afterwards. But I was mentioning this notion of the importance of social support, right? That is the number one factor associated with recovery from PTSD. The second one is ongoing life stress. The third one is the type of trauma. Okay. The fourth one is what the early childhood experiences were like, right? So some of the things we think would be like really top of the list aren't top of the list. It's social support and life stress. And so what that means we can do as communities and neighbors is, and I teach my students this in my courses at Middlebury, if someone's had a trauma, be present but not intrusive, right? Be there for them. Be available. But don't say, Dr. Kimball told me you gotta talk about your trauma, okay? Because I didn't say that, okay? Be patient, right? Because we have to remember, through people's own resilience and coping skills, most people get better, right? So we don't have to rush this. Now, is there a subset of individuals who've had trauma and go to their counselor in high school and say, I really need to talk about this? Yes, and that's appropriate for them. But it's also appropriate for the kid who says, you know what, I really don't want to talk about this, to not talk about it, right? So be available, right, but don't be intrusive, right, number one. Number two, provide practical support, right? If ongoing life stress is the number two predictor, then if they need a few bucks to get them over the hump because they're out of work, because they were injured, provide some money. Like anybody who has had a child, for example, has raised a child from infancy, knows that when that child is born and they're 1 month old, you really don't want someone coming over and telling you how tough it is. What you want is someone to bring a casserole, right? That's what you want. You want someone to bring food, right? And I think people have developed this instinct over time to recognize that reducing ongoing life stress can be really useful, and that's true in the cases of PTSD as well, right? So be available but not intrusive. Do what you can practically to help with ongoing life stress, and keep an eye on them, right? Because in 6 months, if they're clearly not on the path to recovery, all the data indicates that they're not, at that point, at 6 months, if they aren't better, they're not just going to get better. As a matter of fact, they're probably going to get worse, right? Because at that point, 6 months in, they're pairing all these stimuli that they were exposed to with it. Every time they get exposed to, let's say it's a motor vehicle accident, they hear the car start up in the morning, right? They get this strong fear response. Well, that's one more conditioning trial. You've actually strengthened that. It's not getting weaker. It can only get weaker through psychotherapy at that point. And why some people get this facilitation effect and some people habituate, we don't know, right? These differences in biology that make a difference. Yeah?
I think what's really tough, Patri and I both work in a high school setting, is that, oftentimes kids won't talk about their trauma because we're mandated reporters at the same time. So the fear for us is they go that 6 months or they go several more years, right? So they can talk about it without it having to be a mandated situation. And that's hard to sit with.
Yeah, and I sympathize, right? And that's an ongoing situation right up until the age of 18. Right. Once they hit the age of 18, they can report that, and you don't have to because they're not protected in the same way at that particular point. Sometimes it helps, as I know you know, but I'm speaking to the audience, right, to refer them out of the school system. Sometimes they're a little more comfortable, right? So maybe if you can find a therapist for them out of the school system, they're more comfortable telling that therapist and getting the system involved, but not the school, right? Where school stays a bit of a, hopefully, somewhat of a haven. They've got some friends in their circumstances. So that can certainly be really challenging, where the reality is maybe they really want to talk about it, right? But they're not going to, because they know that once that happens, the system gets involved. And as you know, the system sometimes can make things worse rather than better. Yeah.
then you're dealing with that whole concept of word therapy. For some people, they just run 100 miles an hour run in that direction.
Yeah. So there are individuals whose immediate response to these types of emotional experiences to avoid them, right, and to run away. And that works for some people, right? There's a subset of individuals who are able to distract themselves, to keep themselves busy, and that for them is the best way to cope with that. They're able to function, do well, be fairly happy, even after these significant experiences. But there are some set of individuals for whom that's not true, right? And at some point, if all this avoidance intensity is not working, and they're just getting worse, and they're starting to drink, or they're starting to engage in other types of negative coping strategies, that's when it's time to intervene.
How do you intervene, though? That's my point. Like, an individual has to make a decision.
Yeah.
That's the direction. First of all, they have to believe that that's going to, and
Yep.
there's so much negativity out there.
Yeah, there is only so much you can do. There's only so much you can do. You can point in the right direction. You can say, I will go with you. I will help you find the right person. I imagine all of us have been in a situation like this, like where we know someone can really use help. And the number one predictor of success in therapy is motivation. That's the number one predictor. They have to be willing to go. And particularly when you're talking about this type of work, because it's hard work. It is emotionally very challenging to redo these memories every time and go back next week knowing that you're going to have to do it again. Right? That is really hard. You have to be really motivated, and the individual has to basically decide, I'm going to really work hard to kick this. By the way, knowing full well that they could do the whole other thing and only get a little bit better. Right? I mean, most people get considerably better, but not everybody always gets better. Right? And so to maintain that motivation, to work through these really hard times, hoping that you'll get better, is a very hard thing to do, very sympathetic. Yeah?
So I'm wondering about repeat trauma, and I'm thinking like, here with concussion, if you have one, it takes longer the more times you have it. So I'm wondering with repeat trauma, if it changes, like the person who got over something pretty quickly, but it happens again, and after a while it starts to change the reaction, as well as someone who maybe has experienced it, but a repeat trauma that makes it harder for them to recover later. So even if it's a different kind of trauma, so I'm just curious.
So the data leans in the direction that, consistent with what I said earlier with respect to number one predictor, one of the main predictors of developing PTSD when you're traumatized as an adult is if you were traumatized as a kid, right? That generally speaking, we like to think that, or would hope to think that some early trauma would inoculate you to some later trauma. You learn how to, what does not kill you makes you stronger, right? Not true, right? The evidence for the most part indicates that that's not true. And that if you've been traumatized earlier, you're more likely to develop PTSD to a subsequent trauma, okay? And it's probably because of this underlying biology, right? That you sensitize the system, right, into respond to stress as a result of that trauma. And it's definitely true from childhood trauma. It's very clear, for example, that kids who already experience childhood trauma have a completely different neurodevelopmental path, right? That changes the way their brain is configured as an adult, and that doesn't change, right? You can help them cope and deal with that, but once those sort of neurons and some of those pathways get laid during childhood and adolescence, and they're there as an adult, they're harder to change back. So a lot of times those early experiences, the term people use is it sensitizes an individual. Having said that, ongoing stressors as a kid in which they successfully get through are actually very good, right? So if they have some minor stressor or some stressor that's on the edge and they have someone there supportive and they manage to get through it, they actually are better able to deal with stress as an adult. Right, so there is this sort of fine line, but there's this really interesting data that looked at rats who were exposed to quote-unquote trauma when they were rat pups, and the trauma was dirty humans picking up the rat pups, right? And so that was considered a trauma, like from the perspective of a rat pup, that's terrifying. This big monster coming over, picking them up, right? And what was very clear is when they were exposed to that trauma, right, they would regularly have what they call a sensitized stress response system as an adult. So when they got some later stressor in life, the ones who were handled a lot by adults exposed to that stressor responded much more poorly to stress as older adult rats. Their stress response was really quite strong. And this kind of makes sense because the rat pup learns the world's a dangerous place, right? You never know when you're going to get picked up, right? You never know when you're going to get handled, right? And so, the body has to learn how to respond to a stressful world. And so that gets kind of locked in. And so then when they're adult, they respond more strongly. Here's the good part of the story. They found out also that if you left the mom in with those rat pups that were picked up and left with their mom responded better to stress as an adults than ones who didn't get the stressor at all. Okay? Because what would happen is after the dirty humans picked up the rat pup, right, the mother would come over and console the pup. Mostly in the case of rats, they would lick them, right? Rats actually have very excellent maternal behavior. They're very good mothers. And so they would come over and spend time with the rat pup and lick them and lick them and lick them, which modified their stress response and taught them that even at a fundamental biological level that I can have these stressful things happen and in the end it'll be okay, right? And so later on, right, when they're exposed to a stressor as an adult, they don't have this massive stress response that the ones who were exposed and not licked do. So it's really horrible. In this sort of stupid psychology joke, sometimes people refer to, oh, geez, that person didn't have enough maternal licking when they were young. Is this how that turned?
I'm thinking of a child's book, and it's about David, and David does everything wrong. I mean, it gives ideas to the kid, and at the end, the mom is still good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, David. We read David in our time. Yeah.
David's great, and I'm going, what if we read this for them? Let's give them ideas.
My kids were frighteningly attracted to David.
Yes, a lot of them
his
are.
behaviors.
This is
I
great. I
remember
can
him well. Yeah.
You talked about the brain changes a little earlier on. Were those measurable or as a physical change, or were they electronic changes? Or when you said they changed and they didn't change back, and in youth trauma, I can't place it, but it was about 3 comments ago when you talked about, and I was just very curious as how those changes were determined and what change they took. What were they doing? Was there different tracks, or was it different physiologic conditions, or was it physical itself?
All of the above. All of the above, right? So as a function of experience, for example, individuals might learn, the neural systems might learn to release more neurotransmitter. Or they might learn to develop more receptors for a particular neurotransmitter. Or it might increase the strength of connections. Or in organisms or structures like the hippocampus, you might sprout new dendritic trees, right? Or make increasing number of connections, right? So all of those happen as a function of experience, and it's really not like one thing that happens.
How much research has been gone into to revert them back to normal, or do you teach them to adjust to the new changes they've got? How do you modify that? That's really.
How do you modify?
When somebody has those challenges, are you doing it through therapy, or are you doing it through? How do you approach somebody in that situation?
Yeah, you did through the psychotherapy, right? You're not like, in my mind, I'm not sitting with someone thinking, okay, they're sprouting more neural connections, right? But that's what's happening.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what's happening. Yeah. I think I'll take one more question. I got some overdue library fines, and I don't want to hang around too long. So that's one more question.